Around the World with MS World, I'm Dr. Daniel Kantor. I'm here at the American Academy of Neurology annual meeting, and I'm joined by a great friend of MS World, Dr. Doug Jeffery, who is the director of the MS clinic at Piedmont Healthcare in Lake Norman Neurology. I want to thank you so much for joining us. We're hearing not just about relapsing multiple sclerosis, we're hearing about progressive multiple sclerosis. What are we learning new at meetings like the American Academy of Neurology about progressive MS?
Well, we're actually learning a lot. So progressive MS has been real frustrating for a long time because we've never been able to demonstrate that any of our treatments will really affect disease progression or disability progression in secondary or primary progressive MS, and that's recently changed. So we've had 3 trials that have a direct bearing on this. One was the Tysabri trial for secondary progressive MS, and while the trial didn't meet its primary outcome measure, what we were able to demonstrate within the context of that trial was that there were a proportion of patients who had significant clinical improvement. So while we technically had a negative trial, we actually had positive results, and if we'd carried out the trial for another year, the trial would have been successful. There are a couple of things I think that are really important to point out about the types of MS that we talk about, relapsing, remitting versus secondary progressive. And probably the most important thing is that I can tell everybody is that what we call it is based on phenomenology. That's not based on biology. And what treatment response depends on, it depends on biology and not phenomenology. So there have been a great many neurologists who haven't treated secondary and primary progressive MS because we haven't been able to demonstrate that any of our drugs were really effective. But, from anecdotal experience, we know that these patients are treatable. Not everybody responds, but a proportion of patients do respond. And it's so important to remember that the treatment response depends on the underlying biology and not what we call the disease course phenomenologically. So that's the first thing. Then we've had 2 other clinical trials that were successful in progressive MS. So there was the Oratorio trial, which was ocrelizumab in primary progressive MS, which met its outcome measure and decreased the rate of disability progression, along with affecting the secondary outcome measures quite consistently. There was also the siponimod trial for secondary progressive MS, and they also met their primary outcome measure, and they decreased disability progression in patients with secondary progressive MS, and once again, all of their secondary outcome measures were positive as well. So this is a new era. So these treatments they're good. They may not be great treatments for everybody, but I think they will represent a real advance in our ability to treat progressive forms of multiple sclerosis.
For people back home, I think a big question is going to be, are they going to have access to these medicines? So if somebody with secondary progressive MS or primary progressive MS wants to be on one of these medicines, what's your sense? And obviously you can't predict what individual insurance companies are going to do or what the government's going to do, but what's your sense of all that?
My sense is that these treatments will be readily available to patients because the pharmaceutical companies that are making these treatments are dedicated to making sure that any patient who wants to get on these medications will be able to get on these medications. So I'm very optimistic that these treatments will be widely available for any patient who wants to get on that treatment.
Dr. Jeffery, I want to thank you so much for that glimmer of hope, and I want to thank all of you back home for joining us.